I can start. I'm Scott Nicholas. I'm Vice President of Project Formation for the LF. I've been at the Linux Foundation. It feels like a short amount of time, but it's 10 and a half years so far. So when I started, we were adding a dozen projects a year, and now we're adding 150 to 250, depending on the year. And we're supporting over 1,200 projects currently. So great to talk to everybody today. Joanna?
Hi, I'm Joanna Lee. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Programs and Legal at the Linux Foundation and CNCF. I spend a majority of my time on CNCF, but I wear lots of hats. So before I joined the Linux Foundation, I was external counsel to both many standard-setting organizations and open source foundations. So I have a deep background in both standard setting and open source.
All right.
And just to start us off,
Yeah.
the disclaimer portion of the panel is that both Joanna and I are counsel to the LF, but we can't be your attorneys, so none of this is legal advice.
Thank
Continue.
you.
Yes. So, Scott, let's start with the basic question, which is one that we help educate our communities on regularly. What are some of the differences between an open source license and a specification license that an open source developer, really ought to know, because that is one we get?
Yeah, we do get that a lot. And it often starts out in the context of, well, I know this license really well. It solves our problems from an open source perspective. Can't I use MIT, Apache, BSD3 clause, et cetera, for a specification effort? And for purposes of this answer, I'm going to use specification and standard interchangeably. There are nuances and differences in their meaning. We have a number of different frameworks, the frameworks that Jory outlined, on supporting open specification projects. And to look at the differences, first you want to take a look at what are the goals of each project? What are you trying to solve for? In the case of an open source project, you want to have open source that can be used pursuant to the terms of its license by the broader community. In the case of a specification, as Jory described it, it's a recipe. You want that specification or standard to be used to incorporate into products and services, to be built into products and services downstream. So what does that mean? Well, that means if you have an issue with a particular file in an open source project, you pull it out and you put a new one in and you fix the error or whatever the particular situation is. In an open specification project, you have a specification that's being used downstream. And if you change something in a protocol, for example, we're going to use 8 bytes for this instead of 7, you might break something else that's depending on that being 7 bytes and not 8 bytes. And so you want to look at that in a slightly different process in terms of giving more resilience than you might necessarily need to do in an open source type framework. So primary differences in terms of the licenses and what they focus on is, again, going back to what each project is trying to accomplish. In an open specification license, you're getting everybody together, and everybody that's participating in the project is going to make the licensing commitments to the specification. And that's different. In an open source project, you're making a license of your technology that's in your contribution to the project. Somebody else who's participating, I'm not making a license to their contribution. I'm making a license to the software in my contribution. And right there, there's two differences. It's not everybody in the open source project making a license commitment to everything in the project. It's their contribution. And most of the open source licenses are going to focus on licenses to the software, to the code. They're not focusing on different implementations. An open specification license is focused on implementations of the specification and providing more comprehensive licenses. So those are the two primary differences, that's the main reason why people would look at open specification license structure in these situations.
Thank you. Joanna, tossing it over to you, because the CNCF projects, there's a number of specs in CNCF. and the governing board did actually vote recently to improve the community spec license as one of the options that incubating CNCF projects can use. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about like why we decided we needed to make that available for that community, and then what some of those issues you were seeing with some of the spec projects that were licensed Apache and MIT under CNCF. You mind telling us about that?
Yeah, sure. So CNCF has launched a sister entity for standards development under the JDF umbrella. So more information about that will be coming out soon. And that is because the cloud native ecosystem is maturing, and we're seeing more and more specification standard projects coming out of CNCF. And we do want to make sure that they're both appropriately licensed and they have a pathway to international standardization if that's what the spec projects want to be when they grow up. So the community specification license, I mean, this is I consider it a brilliant legal innovation on the behalf of the Linux Foundation and JDF because standards development and open source development, the workflows, the culture, the licensing, the litigiousness, the way IP rights need to flow are in some ways polar opposites. Standards you want to be very stable. It's not good to be revising a standard constantly, whereas in software, if nobody's touched a code base for a couple of years, that's a bad sign of project health, right? And so the licensing, the governance frameworks are really quite different. But it's so important that standards and open source work well together. And so one of the brilliant innovations of JDF is this community specification license, which does provide the essential protections you need for specification licensing, but it works well with open source workflows and GitHub-based contributions. So it's a much more open source friendly way for an open source project that, say, is maturing and wants to develop a companion standard to start down that path of standards development. Now in the CNCF, we are still allowing Apache as a license for API specifications. So a spec that is really just essentially documentation that explains how you interact with that particular piece of software can still be Apache licensed. But anything that's intended to be a standalone standard, so is going to be defining interactions between multiple implementations, that does need to be licensed under either the community specification license or one of the other options for standards licensing under the JDF policies.
I'm going to stick with you because you mentioned litigiousness, which is a fun word to not say. And one of the programs that you worked on, which is super important and doesn't get enough attention, so I'm asking you a question about it, is the NPE defense program with Unified. And this is something that is not directly related to the standards, but I think is very relevant to open source. I wonder if you could give us a 101 version of what that defense program is and why it's important for the community.
Yeah, absolutely happy to. So before that, I'm just going to lay a little bit of foundation for context. So open source and open standards, in some ways are very similar in terms of litigiousness and how IP rights flow. Both between, so operating companies that produce products and services and maybe contributing to standards or open source, so in open source, between operating companies, like there's this cultural standard and licensing standard if it's not open source unless it's royalty free, right? That's not the case in standards. So in standards, even between operating companies, there often are license negotiations and payments of royalties to use each other's patent rights in order to implement a standard. Now there's another set of entities that contribute to 80% of high-tech patent litigation in the US. So it's really a driver of cost. And these are non-practicing entities, sometimes affectionately referred to as patent trolls. These are organizations that don't sell any products or services, So if they just acquire patents and they threaten litigation with them. And even negotiating with an NPE, it often puts an operating company in a disadvantage, because whereas if there's another operating company, you may also have patents that you can use defensively, and there's more of an incentive to play nice if you're operating in the same ecosystem and you need each other's patents and innovations, right? With an NPE that's not practicing, there's not that same ability to bargain. So NPEs in recent years have been increasingly targeting both open source and standards implementations, because these are target-rich environments. The more companies that are implementing, and both open source and standards are intended to be ubiquitous, the more money one can make. And they often succeed because the cost of fighting back is more than often. They tend to price their demand for settlements and royalties so that it's less than the cost of fighting back in litigation. So for an individual company, if an NP is demanding, hey, pay me $200,000 in royalties, or you can pay $500,000 to $1 million to fight back and argue about whether my patents are even valid in court, that's unfortunately a tough choice. The problem is that every time a company pays money to an NP, you are feeding the trolls. It's bad for the ecosystem. You are encouraging them to keep buying more patents and investing in assertions in that ecosystem. And so that's why in 2019, the Linux Foundation partnered with Unified Patents and OIN and Microsoft, and we launched something called the Open Source Zone, which is a zone of deterrence. And this is community-driven NPE deterrence. So what that means is that companies get together and they fund through Unified Patents direct challenges. So for NPEs that have low-quality patents, we will administratively challenge their patents through a procedure called an ex parte re-exam. And because of a leveraged cost model, now you have dozens, sometimes hundreds of companies that are funding this effort. So the economics of fighting back are very different in this community-driven model. The other thing we do is we host crowdsourced prior art contests. And so instead of every individual company who got a nasty gram from an NPE having to do their own prior art research to evaluate whether the NPE's claims are even valid, we're calling on the community of subject matter experts who work in this field, who may be aware of prior art, for example, at a tech conference they attended years ago, or in release notes in an open source repository from 10 years ago. And so we're crowdsourcing this legal research, and then we publish it and make it available to everybody. And we have data showing that even the moment a prior art contest is announced, when we haven't even published a prior art yet, the demands for settlements and royalties from NPEs targeting companies in our ecosystem immediately drops. So it already creates negotiating leverage. And then once we publish a prior art, we have data showing that it drops again. So this is a very powerful tool, and when we do these calls for prior art, we really encourage you to participate. If you search for Cloud Native Heroes Challenge on the CNCF website, you'll find that, and we also publish blogs whenever we have a new contest.
Don't feed the trolls, feed us.
Yes,
right?
Yes, feed us.
Feed us. That's a super good program. I just think we need to. That's one of the resources we should share. Yeah, Scott.
Yes.
We spend a fair amount of time, and this actually speaks to a gentleman's question earlier, helping open source projects, air quote, join a standards body, or to somehow figure out how can we contribute to a standard. That is actually easier said than done. Can you speak to some of the issues and the things that we address when we are and some of the challenges that we address with that when we work with those projects?
Certainly, and it sounds like it should be something very, very simple to do, as Jory said. Standards have been around and been invaluable for a long time. There's standards going back to the 1860s. There are standards organizations that I think are over 100 years old. They have practices and procedures that have been highly effective for their communities. And those types of practices don't change overnight. And so when we're talking about more traditional standards development organizations, in many cases they have approaches such as you're going to join, you're going to become a formal member to make the intellectual property commitments. There will be confidentiality restrictions on everything we do, and then when the standard is published, it's made commercially available for purchase in PDF form or paper form and can be used from the website, and those funds will support the standards development organization. That's an example of some approaches. It's an amalgam of various things that are out there. So when you have an open source project that wants to implement a standard and they want to share some ideas, they want to communicate with the standards organization, that creates some challenges. If you are a maintainer on an open source project and you reach out to have a conversation, the first document you might receive from an SDO is, oh, here, sign our non-member confidentiality agreement. How are you going to share your learnings then with the community to post the improvements to the project to leverage the SDO? It just doesn't really work. The next type of situation you can run into is a lot of cases, general legal opinion is that for particular things you may not need a license to implement a specification. But some cases that might not be the answer. There may be a question as to the copyrightability of the full specification. And so if you go to an SDO that is making money by selling PDFs and right across the top it says all rights reserved, how are you going to, if you need to copy entire portions, how are you going to implement that in the code that you're trying to work? So there are workarounds, there are approaches, as Jory indicated when she was speaking. The first step is talk to the SDO, walk them through these issues. Standards exist to be implemented, so they're not antithetical to the goal. You all share common goals, but the processes are different. Our general workaround is to engage with an SDO through, they often will call it a liaison agreement, we will call it a memorandum of understanding. It accomplishes the same thing. Here's a zone where we're trying to collaborate and we're all going to share ideas. And that tends to work quite well. But it is a process, and it doesn't happen overnight.
So I want to leave a little time for questions because we have such a good room. So I'll leave with the last question to both of you, and we'll start again with you, Scott, because you do a lot of work to help bring, we all do, bring projects into the LF and help them set up for success. I would love for you to share some of the best practices and things that you would recommend for a new project, setting up on our infrastructure. What should companies and contributors be thinking about when they're launching their projects?
So I'll keep this very short and basic, and I'll start with something that Jory said. Sit down and ask yourselves, what is your goal? Are you trying to have a taxonomy, a glossary? Are you trying to set a comprehensive protocol? Think what your end goal is, how you want the specification you're working on to be used. And then immediately, once you've articulated that goal, go to your OSPO. Talk to your open source program management office, talk to your open source legal counsel, and walk them through it, walk them through the goals, and they can help advise you in terms of the structures that you can best use to build out a community and position the project for success. It is easiest to make these decisions on licensing right in the beginning as you're starting. It's not to say you can't pivot. That can be enabled, that happens all the time, but it's easier to address some of these questions up front.
Joanna, what advice do you have to new CNCF spec projects or standards projects in general?
Well, I guess to echo and build on what Scott just shared, in addition to talking to your internal, OSPO, and we're seeing a move towards open source and standards being combined within the same division of an organization. In addition to speaking with the people in your company, come talk to us really early. Because the earlier you talk to us, more than we can also inform you about setting up the right governance, setting up the right IP policy, positioning you for longer term success. So, for example, who do you want to be when you grow up? If your goal eventually is to be adopted into an IEEE standard, well, you should probably take into consideration their IP policy when you choose your own. Or if you want to become part of OCI eventually, then we're here to support projects and help charting a path for to reach those long-term goals.
I'm surprised you didn't say, and also talk to your attorney internally. But yeah, come talk to us. So we have our next talk in this room is at 11:55. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and then we'll let Dan set up. I'm going to run over and bring you with us. Like, I know, but they're recording and stuff like that.
Hi, Scott. Stu Waldron, but I'm asking a question for Open API. I've worked with Dan Scales on several naming of specs we're putting out, but it's never quite been clear the copyright question. Surprisingly, something as ubiquitous as Open API is not copyrighted. So just comments on when is it worth the copyright and when it's not. Trademark, sorry.
So there's a couple levels to that question. When you use something in commerce, and again, I'm speaking generally versus specific advice, there are, at least in the US framework, there are rights that can attach to that. So some projects will have actual registrations for names. Some projects, and I would say probably the majority, will rely upon common law trademark rights. Registration has an expense involved, and it can oftentimes be a sizable number. Now, where you also will see the registration question is in interfacing with other SDOs. We have seen situations where SDOs will be a little bit flexible with the specification, but then if you want to name the fact that you're using the specification, that requires a payment. But again, every project that has a funding arm is going to approach that decision and make up their own mind as to whether or not they want to have trademark rights, formal registration rights.
I think that is another thing to keep in mind when you're launching your project is if you're going to want as part of your program to have a conformance or a compliance program, you probably want to be able to register that. And so naming is something, that you'll need to bear in mind.
So just a question, how much effort do organizations such as the Linux Foundation put into helping open source projects with these things, and do you think that's going to be becoming more of an issue over time?
We have entire teams.
A lot of effort we put into helping. I mean, the trademark team is small but mighty, but it is a team sport. So.
And Jory has an entire standards team, and as Joanna said, we're all here to help. So, and there's a great set of online training materials in terms of if you want to walk through how you can use the specification license structure, the community specification agreement. There's entire tutorials and webinars that are easy to access.
Other questions from the audience about,
Do you have a plan to broaden the SEP area, standard essential patent area? For instance, telecom area. Do you have a plan to broaden the telecom area?
In terms of broadening the patent relationships that already exist, or that I'm less involved in.
So if I can understand, and maybe to Joanna can speak to this, but when a project hosts with us and they select an IP policy, within that structure, there is a set of rules for making exclusions, or and most of our projects are royalty free, but there's a process for excluding an essential claim, right? And so they have to follow that. and they may be excluding that and then monetizing that, and that's their right. So as long as we're following that process, like, good and groovy, but a lot of projects don't understand that sort of mechanism. The claim is licensed to the extent of the scope of the spec. And so that's one of kind of the pieces of the puzzle that our new projects need to think about, defining that scope of the specification, so that kind of defines the rights of the implementers. And then again, for each contributing organization, what is it that they want to contribute, because that's the thing that they want to give the project, versus what IP are they holding back because they want to monetize. And I don't know if you want to say anything about essential claims or anything.
Well, just say it. And you asked specifically about telecom. I'll just say that telecom is a very IP-rich sector. So getting it right is really important. But there's a whole range of models. But most telecom standards, I'm not speaking necessarily of the ones that live within JDF or LF, but most telecom standards are licensed under RAND IP policies.
Hi, this is a question for Joanna, and maybe you as well. I'm curious about how you advise participants who may be comfortable with a certain state of the standard at a given time and say, okay, we're good with the IP dedication or the license, we're granting this standards body this specification, but the specification may evolve over time. Now, I know it's intended to be stable because that helps the entire community and the market and everything else, but technology evolves, so the standard may evolve and new additions come out. How do you deal with that particular aspect?
Ooh, okay.
That's a good one.
I'm not sure how to summarize that in a non-lawyer friendly way in 2 minutes, but I'm happy to chat with you more about that online. But this is partly why standards licenses are far more lengthy and complex than open source licenses. We're never going to get a standards license that's as short as an MIT license. Very unlikely.
We're trying.
Yeah, because so the way it's typically, there is a way it's typically done. So there are usually IP policies for standard setting have mechanisms for both excluding certain patents from the default licensing commitments, but declaring that so everybody is on notice that you're holding some of your patents back. And then there's many standards organizations also have procedures for withdrawing from the standards organizations if, say, there's a new version coming and you don't want to encumber your patents with respect to that new version. There's often procedures for being able to either withdraw or be able to exclude your patent claims. Because we don't do this in open source because, again, in open source you only license if you contribute 100 lines of code, you're only licensing those 100 lines of code. You're not licensing the entire code base that other people contribute. So in standards, because you don't control everything you license, you're obligated generally to license with respect to the entire specification. That's why that's why standards IP policies usually have the ability to opt out.
Dan, why don't you close this out?
Quick question on confidentiality and levels of confidentiality. So in OpenSSF world, we are trying to do stuff in the Global Cybersecurity Policy Working Group that I'm bringing in, a wide range of stakeholders from the open source community, and at the same time we're trying to engage in European standards process, and we're finding that there's a culture clash in terms of the amount of information that can be shared, and we're constantly having conversations like, well, we can't really talk about this, but I can tell you in private, but I can't tell you on this call, or things like that. And how can Linux Foundation help to bridge that gap is my question.
I don't know that there's a quick fix. I think
there's not.
communication of the issue. It can help to have a formal relationship established. At a minimum, even if it's not a signed document saying that we're going to talk to each other, identifying contact points and having a communication about the issue. We don't have non-disclosure agreements with our members. We don't have non-disclosure agreements in our projects. That said, if there's a private meeting to discuss a zero-day vulnerability, it's pretty apparent that everybody in the room is going to keep that quiet until it's fixed, because there's a vulnerability policy for the project that says so. So there is a union of overlapping interests, and hopefully with communication we can bridge that gap. But it's been a challenge for a while, and it also shows up in terms of, I want to attend this conference that that organization in Europe is hosting, and it's not always Europe, but heavily. And right here, everything at the conference is confidential. It's a problem. But again, first step is communication.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So much of it is about meeting a community where they are. And so before I became involved in open source, I actually started doing more work in standards, and there is a big difference in culture, because a lot of standards have been influenced very much by traditional engineering culture. And open source has been open from the beginning. And so there's a lot more, culture and permissiveness around sharing, and everything is out in the open. And so the community specification license, all the work JDF is doing, we're helping meet open source developers who are accustomed to open source minimum viable governance and such access standards in a way that's more accessible and familiar to them. And then, going the other way, meeting traditional standards developer where they are and helping to introduce them to open source principles. We also have staff and practices and procedures where, we are helping to bridge that divide. But sometimes we have to use more traditional standards type mechanisms like liaison agreements to enable that sharing and help create frameworks that are more standards friendly for sharing information either between SDOs or among companies that are participating.
So we are super at time because Dan's talk is up next. I want to say thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to all of you for coming to talk about standards with us.